Hi, this is Mark. I'm very happy today to be joined by Markus Lepola, who's an ethnologist, scholar, and museum worker down in Pargas near Turku in southern Finland. Hi, Markus. Thank you for joining me.
Well, hello, Mark. I'm glad to join you here today.
Markus also has an interest in bushcraft, and that's going to come in useful today while we talk about the subject of puukko knives. But firstly, I think from that introduction, an ethnologist. I had to look this up, so I thought I'd share this with the listener. Ethnology is cultural anthropology. And in even more simple terms, that's the branch of anthropology that analyzes and compares human cultures, as in social structure, language, religion, and technology. And I think the puukko knife, the history and the use of, kind of covers several of those descriptions. Before we start talking, I think just a quick shout out to my friend Henry in Michigan. This is a subject that's very close to his heart because he seems to make puukko knife more often than I make my bed in the morning. So Henry, this one's for you, and thanks for introducing me and Markus to each other. Markus, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work down there, and also a little bit about your bushcraft skills.
Well, as Mark was telling you before we started up this interview, my work is I'm lucky enough to have a very wide scope when it comes to my projects and my work. So, but mostly it's in connection with museums here in the beautiful Pargas archipelago. So I work with exhibits, I work with the museum collections, I work with the children's programs, and all kinds of things like that. And I'm also affiliated with the Obakan University, so I'm trying to with another project of mine is just getting my thesis done, which is far away. Well, I'm pretty far with it, but still there's lots to be done before I can call myself a PhD. Hopefully that'll come very soon. And well, broadly speaking, also enjoy. This is a wonderful area where we're living, so beautiful nature. So I enjoy that a lot. So we have summertime, you go boating. Wintertime, you ski and possibly even ski on sea ice if it's thick enough. So I also enjoy educating people in different contexts. I do arrange classes in different skills, traditional skills, and I've also taught wilderness guides in what's supposed to say traditional skills. So that's pretty much what I do, like on a wide scope.
And you shared a very interesting video with me. Maybe I'll put it into the show notes for this episode of you starting fires with your bare hands and a piece of wooden string as well. So these are the kind of things you teach people.
Well, yeah, but that was actually for the audience to know, because when I was contacted by you, I was I kind of drew some parallels to another Brit I came across in England, where who also was kind of a reporter, living in a different environment. Like you're living in Finland, you see things from a different angle, and the same thing applied for him. And it happened to be a bushcraft festival in Sweden, which I attended last year. I wish I would have attended it this year again, because it's like an annual thing now. But I just didn't have the time because of my work here in Pargas. So last year I attended the festival and met some nice people, and I was suddenly asked to participate in a competition, and I wasn't ready for it because it was a Swedish championships in fire drilling, and being a Finn, I didn't think I would qualify, but I did qualify, and I think I did pretty well. So I didn't put my country to shame in that context.
Well, in the video I saw, you won that particular contest, so I think you held up the Finnish flag with great pride.
Yeah, thank you.
We're here today to talk about this puukko knife. Maybe you can start by explaining the knife, and maybe is there some kind of meaning to that name? Does it have a meaning?
Actually, when we are approaching this issue, we need to at least make a separation here to begin with, because the Puukko knife, when you are talking about the Puukko knife, and English people are talking about Puukko knife, they're thinking specifically of a knife used in Finland, which has a certain feel to it, a certain handle and a blade, and the whole thing. But when we are talking about Puukko knives, like here in the archipelago area, which is this is actually, like, for listeners at home, they should know that Finland has at least 2, if not 3, culture areas with 3 languages. So you have Swedish language culture along the coast, like where I'm living, it's very predominantly Swedish culture, and then you have more Finnish culture in the inlands, like where you're living in Seinäjoki. And from that context, a knife was just called a knife, a kniv. But then, curiously, as in the 1900s, when people in different manufacturers in Ostrobotnia started mass producing these knives, we think about the Puukko knives, then they were being described as Puukko knives even here in the Swedish-speaking part of the country. But people were using knives all the time, but there was a distinction between design and shape of it. So,
what does distinguish the Puukko from other knives with regards to its design?
Well, to understand the distinguishing features, that regardless if you're in the Swedish, Finnish-speaking, or Sami-speaking regions of Finland, people used knives from a day-to-day basis for many different things, like knives in general. And these knives, utility knives, were very simple indeed. They were often, a person who needed a knife would just approach a blacksmith, and the blacksmith would produce a blade for the person. And often even the blacksmith wouldn't even haft the blade or anything, but that was the to do. And often the handle was very simple. It was just the blade was stuck into a piece of wood, preferably a piece of curly birch, which is really durable and won't split that easily. And in some cases, a sheath would also be added to the knife. But in some cases, the knife didn't even have a sheath; it was just kept in a pocket. But and the sheath was very crude.
For health and safety.
Yeah. So because people were using knives, it was like your personal tool. You were using it for eating. You only had like a knife and a spoon when you were eating. So knives were used to cut up bread and everything. They were used for anything. You were always fiddling around, like in an agrarian society. There was always something to cut, and the knife was always handy. And this just went on for centuries. But the Puukko knife, and remember you asking about the name, or actually about the name of the Puukko, like why it's called Puukko. Well, the explanation is that it has the name originates from a German type of decorative knife, which was used by German traders during the Hansa period in Finland, and they were called pukar type of knives or daggers.
So it has a Germanic origins.
Yeah, and it's just it's back to the we going back to the 15th and 16th centuries. So that's and even in the Finnish language you have the name. Well, a person who is causing us making trouble is called Riita Pukari, and Riita is quarrel, like quarrel Pukari, and Pukari is in direct reference to the type of knife which was used. And it is my interpretation is that these knives which were used by the Hansa traders were, they were probably quite basic knife, perhaps slightly larger than the knives that were used by other people, but they were also nicely made with nice sheaths and such. So my interpretation is that this was more of a status object, and they were admired by Finns and others who saw them, and just being, because the knife had been it was a day-to-day, you used it for very mundane purposes, but I think that at that point you wanted to realize that the knife could also be a status object, like it could be pretty, and it was something like you could take pride over of owning.
You make it sound like
So
in Crocodile Dundee, where he pulls it out and says, "That's not a knife. This is a knife."
Kind of like that, yeah.
But you were saying the Puukko became more of a tool here when it became popular.
Well, it was no. I was saying like I think that originally the Puukko, just the idea of having a more of a representative, like nicer tool, was that in a way a Puukko was kind of like a knife. It's just an ordinary knife which was designed in a pretty fashion, and over time we ended up with the knives which we now recognize as Puukkos, these beautiful Ostrobothnia knives. Keep in mind, knives were made like Puukko knives were made in other regions outside of Ostrobothnia as well. But it was in Ostrobothnia where this craft really started growing, and you have knives from the 19th century which look very special, like the Vöro type knife, Vöri Puukko or Vöro, which is Swedish, they were interestingly representative. The sheets on these things look like miniature, sword sheets in a way, and carried on a belt. Very they're expensive to make, and they were status symbols. So I think the Puukko at one point became more of a status symbol as well as being useful.
There's a culture of traditional dress and traditional uniforms in Finland, and each region seems to have its own style and its own colours almost. And the knife is part of that ceremonial costume, at least maybe in certain areas. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's in certain areas they would, like Ostrobothnia, it was very much a part of the costume, and people were carrying knives, for the basis, but it was just not as integrated part of the costume. So Finland is where there are, even though we're not that many, or we weren't that many even back then, but still there are very many differences regionally in how like every village might have a little bit of a different way of viewing things. You should also know that puukkos or knives have had a very different meaning for people back then than they have now. For instance, just the value of having a good tool, having it being produced by a blacksmith, it was a costly endeavor to get one. You wouldn't necessarily own that many knives. You maybe had one or two, or that was it. Often the utility knife, and then if you were a carpenter, you might have a specialty knife. And back, let's say, up to 20th century, people were getting their knives from blacksmiths, and certain blacksmiths had a reputation of being better than others. Often they would use old files which were imported steel, better quality, and remake them into knives. And
which is what I think our friend Henry has done with some of the knives that he's made. I've heard this reshaping a file, which I didn't realize was I should have known it was a tradition that he'd picked up from here, perhaps, but it was interesting to hear.
Because steel in Finland and iron was mostly dependent on whatever bog iron you were able to harvest, and the quality of that wasn't the best possible. So and later on during the Swedish period, obviously there was also a import of steel from the Swedish mills, and quality got better, but even up to the 1900s, just owning a good knife which would not crack when you were cutting through a small spot of branch in a piece of wood, that was a good thing to have.
Maybe you can tell a little bit about the design of this knife, because it is quite distinctive, simple looking design, but distinctive in its shape.
So, well, if you just think about general, in my opinion, general Puukko knife is just that you have a proper knife. You have the blade is not too long. It's just as wide as or as long as your hand's width, really. So maybe 10 centimeters, and then you have a firm handle to it, which often was just a wood handle of maybe burl. Not necessarily always you wouldn't have like any type of piece of brass or something like just to keep the wear of the handle down to a minimum, because the wood would shave off if you're doing a lot of carving and you brush up against the blade, and the blade brushes up against whatever you're carving, and it eats away the wood of the handle. So you would have like and then the pommel is firmly, it's made to fit the hand perfectly, so it won't slide away easily when you're carving out. Like often when you would carve, you would grab the whatever you're carving and just if you're right hand, grab it with the left hand, and then just carve in with the pulling action with the right. So having a like a guard, finger guard, is not necessary with the puukko. It's actually a very unnecessary thing to have.
And it's something that's become culturally quite significant in Finland, not just the sort of ceremonial reasons that we were talking about earlier, but just the way that, for example, my son Olli was given his first knife by his granddad, his vari, over here in Finland, and this thing was all handle. The blade was only a few centimeters long, and the handle was, you know, probably twice as big, and the blade had this sort of rounded end to it, and he seemed to just spend most of his time stripping bark from twigs. We had this collection of smooth sticks that Olli had trimmed had trimmed down for us. But that seemed to be significant, actually being given the puukko as a gift.
Receiving a knife or a puukko as a gift as a child was kind of an important part of growing up when you were big enough to have your own knife, a puukko. And I would like to kind of rewind back to the ritual part of knives, because I just want to pull out a few examples of just how you would get like an image of how rich the traditional with knives is actually in Finland. For instance, if you happen to break your knife, you know, there was for a long time in different parts of Finland there was the belief that you shouldn't discard the blade which you broke, because it had still magical potential. And often, well, people were very superstitious, so you know there are like different variations of different magics you could do for, you know, if you have your sick livestock is ill and so on, that would possibly involve having the blade of a broken knife, which you would perhaps cut off some hairs off the back of the sick cow and or toss this knife over a sick cow, and there were lots of different magical tricks you could do, and often like a broken knife was included in this type of magic. Yeah. But the magic was with the knife, it had to be accidentally broke. You couldn't break it on purpose and use it, because then it didn't have any magic. So that's one aspect. And there's much more, but that's just one. But also there is an interesting tradition when it comes to young men and young women in the marriageable age. In certain parts of Finland, in the Finnish parts of Finland, they have this tradition of I think it's called in Finnish tupella käynti, or I think roughly it translates to going around with the sheets or presenting the sheet. And it would involve a young maiden who was in an eligible age and wanted to get married. She would stand outside the church on Sunday when people were coming for services, because you had to go to services Sunday church, and she would stand there just with the knife sheet. And if there was a young man who was interested in her, he would present his knife and put it in her sheet.
It sounds like a Finnish version of Cinderella or something.
Yeah. However, there's an finesse to this. He would not receive an answer at the point, like if he was accepted as a suitor or not. He would at least have to wait until the next day, on which he would, go to the house of the girl in question, and he would approach. At that time, because I'm talking about the 1800s, at that time people were often putting their knives and spoons, they were hanging it on the outer wall of them. And if he were to find his knife among those knives, then he would know that he's been accepted, as a suitor, because if his knife was among the family members' knives. But if it was in some other spot, like at the door, stuck in between the door, then he knew that, tough luck. Maybe next time.
And he has to go and take his knife back from the door and try again another Sunday.
Yeah. So another sander, another sheath.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
That was one way of matching knives with sheaths. So there's a very rich tradition of how knives are interwoven into the society and culture of people around here.
Yeah, and also my girlfriend Satu, she's from the east. She's from Kite, but she has these strong memories of using her puukko for making vasta or preparing fish. And she insisted that I call it vasta and not vita. It matters. These things are very important within Finland.
Yeah, it's actually vihta, not vasta.
I'll let her find that out for herself by listening to this.
It's well, in the western parts of Finland, it's a vihta. In the eastern part, like Kite, it's vasta. And that's
this is the birch branches that you use for cleaning and
it's the same thing. It's just a different name. Yeah.
Yes.
The way it's but before internet, I enjoyed explaining what vasta and vihta are to foreigners who weren't acquainted with the sauna culture.
I think there's still plenty of people that could learn about this sauna culture, and that's the whole point of this podcast, I guess, is to just help people understand a little bit more about how life is over here.
Yes. But I could actually add with Puukkos, I find that like life over here in north parts of Europe, like Finland, I also during my, I don't know if I would call it career or life, had opportunity of doing a lot of different things in a lot of different parts of the world. And I remember particularly a couple of years back when I was in Alaska for the summer with the Alutiiq people, and knowing that we were out in camps out in the like maybe call it wilderness, because there was no cell phones that worked there and bears all over the place. But they were like tradition camps where people were just engaging into different activities of making traditional things and such. And I did bring a few knives, extra puukkos, with me, and they were very popular among those who received them.
Okay.
Cherished and lovely, because they're just so practical. They're easy to carry, light to carry, and they just grow on you immediately. It's
receiving
like
a good knife, a good puukko as a gift is a great honor in Finland, and it seems like you carried on that tradition now in Alaska as well.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of interesting connections with Finns and Alaskan Eskimo, because there are similarities in the way you interact and how you think about the environment, how you work with the environment, we just connected on a puukko level. Really, it's easy to connect on that level because it's the tool that makes everything possible. Really, if you would call a good axe is something that you would refer to as the key to the forest. But a puukko is more or less a key to everything else, because with a knife you could do like 99% of what you needed to manufacture at home, because you couldn't buy stuff. You had to make them. Were made by just using that knife for the puukko.
What about some of the legendary stories that you hear? I don't know if it's just here in Etelä-Pohjanmaa or South Ostrobothnia, but who or what were the puukkojunkari? Are they fact or fiction?
It's a fact and partly even fiction, but the puukkojunkari is a very it's typical for southern Ostrobothnia, Finnish part of Ostrobothnia, where you would have these strong men, village men that kind of were like some would describe them as mafia bosses with a posse, and they would go around threatening people and sometimes using the knives or puukkos to get to intimidate their opponents. And often they would refrain from cutting them like stabbing. It was more like cutting, raising the faces or cutting up the clothes and stuff like that. It's so this was a real thing back then, and some people find pride in it, others don't. To understand this phenomenon, you have to understand that the phenomenon started off in the 18th century. And it first started off in the Swedish-speaking part of Ostrobothnia in Vöri, where you had this type of let's say young men who were being, very, very predominant, active, and maybe a little bit violent towards others. Not necessarily always using a knife. They could also use other types of things to harm each other, but but they were being, going out of bounds with this even in the 17th century. And know of that because the priesthood that was being in charge of upholding the law and order, they would write down these different things they did and how they would approach it and how they would be punished for it. But keep in mind, Finland in the 18th century was a country which had a lot of grievances. There had been a Great Northern War. The Wrath, which you call the Great Wrath, had more or less destroyed Ostrobotnia. There was a lot of violence involved with the Russian. It was actually this is actually a war where Russia would took over Finland, and there were a lot of atrocities being made. And this has an impact on people who survive it. Like today, when you have people who survive or are running away from war, they have a different approach to violence. And this phenomenon in the Southern Ostrobotnia kind of echoed what happened more than a century before in in the Swedish part of Ostrobotnia. So it transgressed from there, and knife became more maybe in this later part. The knife became more predominantly part of the violence than it was before, just because it was also a custom of having nice knives and showing them as status symbols. This was a phenomenon which was not common in any other parts of Finland, and it also had to do with the fact that in Ostrobotnia there were less lands available for more young people, and that created some type of social strife, which also added to the whole soup, where you have young men who don't have land and aren't able to do too much about the situation, and they get frustrated, and this was kind of a result of that.
I guess another result of that would have been the waves of emigration from Finland over to America, Canada, yes, Australia.
But that was later on.
Okay.
This only later on was kind of the release. Once you had many people leaving the Ostrobotnia region to America and Canada because there was a surplus of young men and people who didn't have access to their own lands. They couldn't, Back then the tradition was that if you were the firstborn son, you got the whole thing. The whole farm was yours, period. And as more and more children survived childhood due to a better living condition, then more children would survive, and then that kind of caused this problem as well, that you just had this surplus of young men and the tradition of violence, which echoed the wars with Russia in the previous century. And you have to keep in mind that you also had old soldiers living in villages back then who were, every village had to have one soldier that they would give to service for the king. And these soldiers were kind of rough around the edges, and they were in every village. So that also added to the social mixture of the time.
I in one of my earlier, back in season 2, I did a couple of episodes about emigration. I went to Peräseinäjoki, nearby to Seinäjoki here, and visited the Emigrant Museum. And there were two episodes, one about the emigration and then one about these houses that they were moving back to South Ostrobotnia from, one from Australia, one from and one from Siberia. And the story there was of this guy. I'll give the short version now, and if anyone wants to hear the full version, they can go back to that other episode. But Matti Unkeri from Kauhava, who used his puukko to foul means and committed murder, was sentenced, had a life sentence, and then exiled to Siberia. And to get from Finland to Siberia in those days, there was no Trans-Siberian Express to take. It was by foot. And then he, after the end of his sentence, he settled down in a farm in Omsk. And then one day decided he had to come back to Kauhava to collect his tools, and walked back by foot, but only could stay one day because he was recognized and there was a threat, threats against his well-being. And so he walked back to Siberia. And now, Marcus, you're smiling, and no one can hear you smiling, and you might say that that's all a legend, but I like that story, even if it's
actually
made up.
They are. I think that story is true, and there are different stories about Finns getting either. Siberia was in a way, a very lenient way of punishing people, because this is during the 19th century Russian rule, when Finland was more or less corporal punishment was more or less abolished and replaced with sending people to Siberia. And that also has to do a little bit with the type of violence which knives enable, because when I was describing the situation in Vero in this post-war Finland, where violence was common, beatings of people and knife cuttings, during that time Finland and Sweden were the system of law was very old. It was like what we call the old provincial laws were still in effect, and according to the old provincial laws, which are essentially medieval, you could pretty much beat up anyone to a certain extent and only have to pay a small fine for it. However, if you were kill them or stab them or cut their faces so they would be scarred for life, or cut off a limb or something, then you would have to pay the ultimate price, which is your own life.
All or nothing. There was nothing in between there.
Well, yeah, because people didn't really, jailing was not that common back then. They didn't really have in jails, so yeah, it was either fine, like you pay for it, or then you die for it. So it was either or. It only became more lenient during the Russian times, when you gradually started to move away from corporal punishment and getting in jails and such.
I'm not so sure that walking from the west coast of Finland to Siberia for work in the gulag or whatever it was called in those days is necessarily better than the death penalty. I'm not so sure.
But people could return from Siberia in theory. Often they didn't. They did have a president that did return from Siberia, but that's a different story. But however, that is a good story, and I do think it's a true story.
Maybe that true story is a good place to wrap it up for today. We've been talking for I don't know 45 minutes or so, which is great. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anywhere that people can connect with you? Do you want to share any Twitter handle or anything like that?
Well, I did have the Scary YouTube channel, which I'm still trying to produce more material for, because it's something that I do, but it's also intended for some of my friends which are into the same things that I am here locally. So that's something you might want to check out. It's the Scary channel, Scary.
Okay, and maybe you can send me the link and I'll put it into the show notes as well, so that people can find you on there.
So that's one way of finding what I'm doing, but like often want to bring up, as I feel is important when people are, like we were mentioning, bushcraft and stuff like that. People are trying to get back to this kind of a more genuine form of living and connecting with the outside world. Often I find that it's very much about survive this and survive that, and big knives, you hit them with rocks, and there's a lot of knowledge which is, I wouldn't say lost, it's just ignored, of how much these things beforehand. And that's something I would like to inform people about, that hey, there was a different way of approaching these things before, and now it's almost like a survivalist thing. When it necessarily doesn't really need to be that. And in fact, I think I feel that you lose a lot of other knowledge that way if you approach things too survivally, and because there is always things to do in the Finnish nature. You can enjoy it. You can make a vihtara vasta, or there. So if you go out in the bush and just think, now I'm going to survive this, then you are kind of missing out on the whole idea of being out in the bush.
Yeah, you should enjoy it, not just worry about needing to survive it, I guess.
And and you should bring your children. You should connect with them, and it's also richness to have this knowledge, like this story you picked out, for instance. That's richness that you have that story, because you can share that with your children, and they can connect to that story, and you can other knowledge about knives, that my grandfather used to save his broken knives because his grandfather used to do it too, because they had a magical significance and stuff like that. So that's, you know, it's bridging the gap between the generations and connecting people differently in their lives.
Want to learn a little bit more about this traditional bushcraft, do you have somewhere that you would direct them to, or should they find your YouTube?
Well, no, we are setting up that currently here in this area because there's a lot of wilderness here, a lot of beautiful nature, and there are less visitors during autumn and spring. This is a very touristy region with a lot of islands, so there's, you know, we're filled overcrowded with people in summer times, but the autumn and spring are, you know, perfect times to visit this area. There's a lot of history. We got, you know, Bronze Age, Viking Age. There's nature. You got seals. You got eagles. You got even wolves. We had wolves that were attacking a maimed cow just 3 kilometers from where I live. So there's a lot of nature here, and a lot to explore, and a lot of possibilities for more adventurous people as well as families too. But this is something we're just setting up because there are young people who want to work with this issue, but they just don't have the channels to do it.
Okay.
Yet, but we think this is a growing industry.
When you have something to direct people to, then by all means give me the address, and I'll
okay, thank you.
I'll put the link on the notes there. And one more time, Markus Lepola, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.